Halito, Gamshilakwan. I'm Mark Harris. Welcome to Season 8 of DiversiTV, a weekly interview show broadcast here from Lane Community College, where we look at issues around the general rubric of DiversiTV. Tonight we'll be looking at what I call legal perspective, and I'll be introducing our guest shortly. But in case you're new to DiversiTV, welcome. If you are part of our continuing fanatic legion of fans, welcome back. The mission of DiversiTV is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. And to that end, we generally follow a pattern of following ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, and a bunch of other issues. And today we're taking a slightly different tack that hits on all of those. Tonight we're looking at a legal perspective with Greg Hazarbedian, who's the Executive Director of the Public Defender Services for Lane County. In our system of justice, the accused has the right to an attorney even if they can't afford one, and of course the presumption of innocence until guilt is proven, regardless of the assumption of guilt for any of a variety of reasons, in case you have an excellent suntan or poor or indigent or your past behavior. Defending people is hard, demanding, intellectually challenging work. Whatever you may think about lawyers in general, it's often beyond the skill of even the well-educated layperson, and not a thing to attempt alone, even if you've seen a lot of court TV or Perry Mason, if you're old enough to remember that. So I really heartily recommend against that. And so to give insight into what public defense is, Greg and I were at the same meeting a few weeks ago and asked him to come on the show. Now, one of the standards that is talked about in the discourse of law is the reasonable person standard. It used to be reasonable man. So, but in diversity circles, we thought, what would a reasonable person, what would a reasonable, supply your own particular category. So, if you were in trouble, how would you want to be defended if you needed to be defended? So, I looked up some things on the website of the Oregon Defender's Office, and under, for example, because I am a drug counselor, my eye was immediately drawn to the continuing education section of all things cannabis. Go back to the slide for a second. So one of the things that I saw in categories, the National Cannabis Legislative Update. Cannabis pre- and postnatal, the science of prenatal exposure, and the state's involvement postpartum. So basically, can a mom be prosecuted for smoking cannabis while essentially delivering a drug substance to the baby? And is that to be treated the same level, for example, as, say, delivering heroin, alcohol, or other substances because it's an illegal drug? The Oregon Medical Marijuana Program. What is it? How to access records and issues related to medical cannabis and parenting. Let us pray. Religious use defense to cannabis prosecutions. Defending DUII cannabis cases. Law, trial tactics, pharmacology. Let's see, fishing on the interstate. Search and seizure issues in cannabis car stop cases. Federalism issues in medical cannabis. Using an expert in garden and quantity cases to defeat boy delivery charges, and also, of course, in a separate category, capital defense issues. So we're not necessarily going to focus on some of these, but of necessity we'll focus on some of them at some point. Our guest tonight, Greg Hazarbedian, Executive Director of Public Defender Services of Lane County. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
So, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, from a little town named Albany, right next to Berkeley.
Oh, okay. All right.
And I found my way up to Eugene about 21 years ago.
Okay. Just 4 years less than me.
Yeah.
I was born in the Haight, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how did you come to do the work you do generally in public defense, yourself personally?
I I went to law school in 1988 to become a criminal defense lawyer. There's never been any other type of law that has attracted me, and so that part was clear. I started off in this public defender's office that I'm now the director of as a law student doing clinical work there. I was in private practice for several years, and the last 5 years I've been the director of it. Came back to the office as the executive director. I've never done anything but criminal defense, and for me it was just obvious that's what I was meant to do.
So how do you get to be a public defender?
You go to college, you get a 4-year degree in anything, you get accepted to law school, you graduate law school, and then you pass a bar exam. As you know, lawyers are licensed by individual states in this country, and I knew I was going to stay in Oregon and took the Oregon bar exam.
The reason I ask that is in my work and also in my career, I have gotten asked by clients, sometimes with criminal background, sometimes not, what would you do if you couldn't fail? And I'd want to help people like me. Sometimes that's being an attorney. And I definitely know that, friends of mine from high school, in fact, one of my high school friends is a public defender in New York, basically, who called me up and said, you need to get your FBI file. Like, wait, I have one? He said, yeah. Because of our activities, he says, I looked at mine, got one from the CIA, et cetera, there's nothing there. They said, haha. But because of what was redacted, you got one too.
Right.
And so he's doing, public defender work there. And so, and he chose that area of the law too, in terms of looking at our social justice work, in interest in high school. So I do know, as you've talked about, that there are people that focus on that rather than go into corporate, rather than go into prosecutorial, et cetera.
I think one of the differences between people who become defense lawyers or public defenders specifically, and people who become prosecutors, is that many of us who are on the criminal defense side of the aisle are very concerned about the government taking away civil liberties of our people, and I certainly count myself as one of those people.
Sure. So who do you defend? Adults, juveniles? What's the divide there?
Our office has 3 lawyers who practice full-time in juvenile court, and we have 19 lawyers who practice in adult court. So the answer is mostly both, but mostly adult cases.
Okay. And generally speaking, who chooses to do that? For the same reasons that you do, or varied?
I would say that what is in common is a desire to help the less fortunate. By definition, the 22 of us who are lawyers in this office are somewhat fortunate. We are highly educated. We're middle-class people. We're doing pretty well in this world. Our clients generally don't fit those definitions. That's how you get to be our client. The financial cutoff for the court deciding who gets appointed a court-appointed lawyer or not is roughly the same as food stamp eligibility. In rough terms. We don't make those determinations, the courts do. And so largely it is public defenders are people who have a strong desire to help the less fortunate, a strong desire to keep the government honest and make sure that the civil liberties of everybody are upheld. And of course, as we've seen historically and can imagine, when people want to take away civil liberties of groups of people, they start with less popular groups of people. And one could argue that some of the people we represent fit that definition.
Sure. So your office is a private nonprofit, but it's the state that pays you, or the government essentially that pays you?
Yeah, that's correct. Most of us, particularly people who come from other states, are used to the idea of public defenders being government employees, either county employees or state employees. Oregon has a system where private nonprofits are what public defenders are. So my public defender's office here is incorporated as a private nonprofit law corporation for the sole purpose of contracting with the government and providing these services. We contract with the Office of Public Defense Services in Salem, which is an arm of state government, and they get the appropriation from the legislature to fund all of public defense in Oregon. So in Oregon, we have public defenders' offices like ours. We have lawyers who do court-appointed work as a law firm. We have consortia of lawyers who band together and provide the service. We have several different types of providers in Oregon. And we, Public Defender Services of Lane County, is a private nonprofit corporation that's been in existence about 32 years now.
Okay. Let's see. So the image that I have, what was that? The Al Pacino movie.
Oh.
And Justice for All.
Right.
Right. I guess that's New York, and I guess, I don't know if that was the same arrangement, but the popular image of public defenders is somehow less than what you get with, say, a family friend, Johnny Cochran.
Right.
So that's not accurate.
It's not entirely accurate. It's partly accurate. There are places in this country where public defenders are representing thousands of clients per year, literally thousands, where the caricature of the New York or Philadelphia thing you're talking about from the movies,
right,
where the public defender meets the client and 5 minutes later they're pleading guilty to
right,
something.
Right.
That does exist in this country.
Okay.
It's 40 years after the Gideon decision, when the U.S. Supreme Court said you have the right to counsel. We still have large parts of this country that do not furnish adequate representation to poor people accused of crime. I'm happy to say that that image of the public defender, which still exists in some places, does not exist in Oregon. Does not exist in California. It's not Washington. On the West Coast, we do it better.
Okay. Why, do you think? I'm asking from a point of view of infrastructure, right? Because you think about the travails of this state financially. Okay, so since we both came from Cali, right? So much is made of the sales tax and how that funds revenue, and we're seeing that having a sales tax hasn't helped California recently. So how is it possible then? The Gideon decision obviously said that you had to have a right to attorney, but doesn't set funding levels.
Correct.
As or a minimum infrastructure, because I remember at the meeting you were talking about in terms of the things that you provide in terms of DNA evidence and other types of support, to mount an adequate criminal defense, are provided for here that aren't provided for in other places. So what is that difference?
The legal system as a whole in Oregon is a cleaner operation and a more ethical operation than it might be other places. And it's largely due to the courts we have in Oregon. We have a Court of Appeals in this state, and we have a Supreme Court in this state that is not simply going to rubber stamp every conviction that comes up to them for review if they don't feel like the defendant got a fair shake and a fair trial and had a reasonable representation along the way. And so ultimately it's up to the courts to keep the rest of us performing up to level. Politically, the legislature in this state learned. You may remember in 2003 there was a crisis in funding for public defense and for the courts in this state. And courthouses were shut on Fridays, and there was many criminal cases that were postponed for 3 or 4 months because there were not defense lawyers available at public expense to represent these people, and who were arrested on the fairly minor crimes at that point. And what we learned together as a state is that police can arrest people accused of crime, suspected of crime, and the district attorneys can file charges against those people. But that's where it stops unless you have a public defender or other court-appointed lawyer available. And when there wasn't money sufficiently to pay court-appointed lawyers in 2003, part of the system ground to a halt. And those cases, minor cases, were put over for several months. Public defenders were furloughed. People in my office, I was not in the office at that time, but people in my office went weeks without work or without pay until things got restored. And the whole system learned that providing somebody accused of crime a competent lawyer is in fact part of what is needed to make the criminal justice system work. Okay. And although we are now in very hard economic times at the state level and other levels, I think that lesson wasn't lost.
Okay. Yeah, because I was wondering, because that would be where I'd go next.
Right.
That's where we are, so
no.
We've learned and...
Right. Now, lest anybody watching this gets the wrong idea about adequate funding, let's talk about what we accept in Oregon as adequate funding for public defense. Okay. I don't want anyone to think it's on par with the prosecution. In our office, I mean, it's adequate given what we have learned to accept.
Yes.
It's not what it should be.
Okay.
The lawyers in my office work every bit as hard as the lawyers in the district attorney's office. And on average, if you look at a lawyer with the same level of experience, public defenders are paid about 30% less than their counterparts who are prosecutors. That's not a complaint about the district attorney's office. I don't think they're overly paid. I think I'm not able to pay my lawyers what they're truly worth. Okay. That's the same throughout Oregon. Okay. Prosecutors...
Could you give me an hourly figure?
I can tell you that lawyers who do public defense at an hourly rate, who don't work for the public defender's office, are now $45 an hour is the rate. Okay. That's less than your plumber, that's less than your TV repairman. That's you can't hire too many professionals for $45 an hour. Right. Our lawyers, of course, are paid on a salary. I pay my lawyers on a salary, and we get, compensated slightly different than lawyers working on an hourly basis. Right. But that puts some sense to
it does. So because, as an example, because, we both have friends that are lawyers that work in other fields of the law, and so if I were going to actually privately pay for, criminal defense, then I'm looking at $200, $300, $400 an hour,
certainly,
depending on who it is. Yeah. Right? And that's the Eugene market. We're not talking about Los Angeles and New York.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being, it's one of those, the French have a saying, l'esprit d'escalier, the spirit of the back stairs, what you would have said if you'd said something. So the context is I'm on, the train to Paris, and these women are talking about, the corruption of the Obamas and how Michelle took a nonprofit consulting gig where she was paid $300,000 for a year. So I figured, okay, so I've got my nerd watch, so I figured out what that is. That's $150 an hour. For a Harvard lawyer, that's cheap. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's 3 times what you said a public defender got here. So for nonprofit consulting, that's nothing. So because if you don't know that, or you don't think to do the math, or you don't listen to anybody beyond Glenn Beck, then right.
And I can also tell you, having been in private practice for many years in my career, the fee that's collected doesn't go straight into my pocket. No. There's a building, there's a secretary, there's a legal assistant, there's a lot of overhead associated with practicing law.
Yeah. So what kind of caseloads do individuals' attorneys have?
The lawyers in our office and the lawyers in most of the public defenders in Oregon are handling caseloads that are within national caseload standards. Okay. We are worked hard. We are my lawyers are mostly putting in more than 40 hours a week to do the work. Right. But we are not practicing outside the standards that have been set nationally as recommendations for what is a caseload that a lawyer can ethically represent people. Because obviously if you have a certain amount of hours available in a week and a certain amount of clients, you do the math. Right. And it needs to be where every client is represented at a level where the lawyer has the time to represent the client at a high level, and I believe we accomplished that, certainly for the most part. There are states where the caseload on lawyers is simply unimaginable to me, and where lawyers, instead of representing a few hundred clients a year, represent thousands of clients a year, and I just can't imagine I can't imagine operating that way. I don't know that I would be able to be part of a system where clients were being wholesale not taken care of.
Yeah. So the state website says that you are on the Capital Defense Board. Still?
Okay, I am on the Oregon Criminal Defense Lawyers Association,
That's what I meant.
Capital Defender Committee.
Yeah,
Yes, and I became part of that committee quite a few years ago when I started representing people on capital cases, and for about 10 years I represented people on death penalty cases. The last 5 years before I took this job, I did that more or less exclusively. I'm very pleased to tell you I have no clients on death row. That was very fortunate. But I have maintained an interest in that area of the law, and certainly the politics around that area of the law.
Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I have a long-standing opposition to the death penalty, and we could spend several shows on that alone.
Sure.
We don't need to do that here.
But it's definitely worth talking about.
Suffice it to say that anything that involves humans is going to involve mistakes.
Yes.
The death penalty involves a situation where those mistakes can become irretrievable and non-correctable. Mm-hmm. And therefore, even if one philosophically believes that death is an appropriate punishment, I would hope that philosophical belief would not trump the practical problems with implementation. And so what we have
Talk about some of those.
Well, nationally, nationally there have been several hundred exonerations based on DNA testing. I have met 2 individuals who were released from death row after being wrongly convicted and sentenced to death. I have personally met 2 of those people. One of them, I believe, is named Freddie Pitts, a gentleman from Florida who I met at a conference out of state several years ago. The thought that as Americans or Oregonians we would countenance a system where somebody would be executed who was factually innocent. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about guilty of something else, but factually the wrong person. Right. The thought that we would countenance that and claim that we are any kind of advanced civilization boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, the current story with the governor of Texas and that arson case, like, okay, right.
Mm-hmm. I'll be clear, I'm not aware of anybody there's about 32 men, and I say men intentionally, on death row in Oregon. I'm not aware of anybody wrongly convicted on death row in Oregon. There are certainly people who are in the appellate process, and that's to be determined whether appellate courts at the state or federal level determine that in fact has happened. But because we have a relatively high standard of representation in this state, I'm not aware of anybody on death row in Oregon ever being exonerated as being the wrong person.
Do you handle the appeals? I mean, your office?
Our office does not handle the appeals.
Okay, so just the primary case?
We're the trial lawyers. The Office of Public Defense Services in Salem, the same agency that gets the whole appropriation for Oregon from the legislature for public defense, they also have a division, the appellate division, and they have, I believe, maybe several dozen lawyers there who handle appeals on criminal cases.
We were talking briefly, I think, I was talking about a part of my doctoral training in which I came across a study by, I believe it was Moran, that talked about the race of the victim determining whether the prosecution sought a death sentence. Or actually, Moran was talking about convictions.
Yeah, that's right.
So that seemed to indicate that essentially that all life isn't valued. I mean, that would sort of lend credibility to the argument that the death penalty is not applied equally, or that not all life is valued equally, and that we should, seek more humane solutions other than capital punishment.
Yeah, that's one of several good reasons why the death penalty seems a poor idea.
Have you seen any of that evidence of that, or institutional, I'll just say it because I can say it, institutional racism within sentencing in Oregon in your career here?
I want to be careful how I answer the question, not because I'm going to say anything that frightens me, but because I want to be careful that
Precise,
I don't say what I do not mean to say.
Right.
I think people from communities of color in Oregon can receive disparate sentences. I do not believe that I have encountered prosecutors or judges who would do that intentionally.
Okay. Okay. All right. As far as capital is concerned, capital cases are concerned.
In capital cases, I have not.
Okay.
I have not encountered that at all. I have represented people of different races accused of capital crime. I have, in those cases, their victims have been of different races, and I have not seen that effect in Oregon.
Okay. The meeting that we met, basically I was testifying to the County Human Rights Commission on a pattern of what I perceived to be discrimination, basically usually in the juvenile justice system, but I'd also encountered it within the adult system, where the phenomenon that's referred to as disproportionate minority confinement. A higher proportion of minorities get either contact, it's not just confinement, it's also contacts of all kinds, where minority groups who are not well represented in the population at large seem to have more contacts with police and seem to be sentenced longer, or maybe even sentenced more often and also more severely within juvenile and then eventually adult court in Oregon. And it was my contention basically that a lot of this is untreated substance abuse, where you have people arrested as juveniles or contacted as juveniles with drug offenses who don't get drug treatment, and get multiple drug offenses where there's a clear indicator, okay, there's a drug problem here, where's the treatment? Because the white kids are getting treatment, but you have this black kid, with 9 MIPs and 9, possession charges, and there's no treatment. And then they basically free fall through the juvenile system and, as adults. And so I actually met one that I met as a juvenile in a local high school that I met again as an LCC student after his release from prison. And it was all drug offenses, and all his crimes were drug-related, burglaries included. And he said he never got drug treatment, even in prison. And the first time he did get drug treatment was seeing me. So, an 11-year span. So, and my contention was, look, your disproportionate minority confinement is being driven by untreated substance abuse. So, even though I did see one of our students, roughly, as I mentioned, get sentenced, to 24 years in prison, and not 24 months in prison.
Yeah, quite a difference.
Quite the difference, yes. And at least there was a determination made that he was drug dependent, and I'm not excusing his behavior because, quite frankly, it was stupid. Okay, right? You get caught, and with a quantity of money, they're going to assume you're dealing. So sorry,
right?
They will throw the book at you, and I think rightfully so. But still, where is the treatment in there? And sometimes, in terms of looking at drug offenses, I'm not necessarily seeing the treatment standard or the medical standard being applied. And so what part does the justice system play in that?
It is always a challenge to convince prosecutors or convince courts that clients of whatever ethnic background have issues that do not, as you correctly said, do not excuse their conduct, but certainly help explain their conduct.
Yes. Right.
And we both know, and everybody watching knows, that the large majority of people who are swept up in the criminal justice system are there because of drug or alcohol problems.
Yes.
That's not a mystery to anybody.
Not a mystery at all. No.
And so, of course, the trick is how do we take that population and get them into drug treatment before they offend seriously enough to go to state prison?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's a continuing challenge. We have in this county right now, we have a situation where a lot of people are not being held in custody who would be in a resource-rich environment or would be in other counties. And to some degree, I know it's ironic to hear that from the public defender, but to some degree, the inability to hold people in custody a few days is not to their benefit.
No.
Because they get arrested, they're on a meth run, they're committing crimes, they get released within a few hours, and they go back out and continue it. And by the time, as public defenders, we get some of these clients, they've run up such a string of offenses that they are going to go to state prison.
Yes.
Whereas if we got hold of them long enough at the front end, or even at the juvenile end, like you were speaking about, we might have been able to get them into treatment and nip it in the bud, nip that problem in the buds.
Right.
Didn't mean a bad pun there.
I mean, and we can talk about the whole cannabis issue too.
Yeah,
I mean, but,
yeah. So it's very unfortunate when we see people who are drug dependent committing crimes only because of that not receive treatment.
Right.
I know in our office we are constantly finding ways to hook up clients with treatment. People who are put on probation are generally required to do drug treatment if that's related to why they're on probation. I heard what you said the other night about the juvenile department, and that's something that I need to look into, as well as what you said. I don't have the ability to speak to that here today, but certainly I have the idea that I need to mention that to my juvenile lawyers and see if they've noticed any racial disparities. I know that when lawyers in my office feel a client was unfairly treated, I often hear about it. We talk about cases in the hallways and everything, and that would certainly have risen up if anybody thought it was a racial disparity. Mm-hmm. We may be talking about kids not getting treatment who never got lawyers.
Mm-hmm. Could be.
Because I suspect I would have heard about it.
Yeah, yeah. And part of what I was trying to convey at that meeting too, and not just to single out the juvenile department, but because I have talked with those personnel and have been working, fairly diligently and attempting to work closely with them for my entire time here. So I've worked this problem from not only the juvenile department, but the treatment system, the treatment agencies, juvenile court, and training drug counselors. So all of them,
right.
And basically, look, okay, kid has 9 offenses and no referral treatment. That's one piece, okay. So when we get, Judge Leonard or somebody else, and okay, you get one of these kids. So I sat on an advisory board of one of the treatment agencies, and all those kids were adjudicated. Okay, so one, the agency didn't even track ethnicity before I got on the board. 2, the entire time I was on the board for about 4 years, just using African American kids as an indicator, they had 3 in 4 years, and none of those successfully completed. So then there's another piece about what constitutes effective treatment once we get them, right? Exactly. Another piece entirely.
Right.
So again,
I mean, one size fits all often means one size fits no one.
Right.
And
yes.
so the ability to fashion programs of whatever description that will actually reach the people they're meant to reach is a challenge. I know Spanish-speaking people, you can't do effective drug treatment through an interpreter. It doesn't work the same way. And so there's a lot of issues around whether or not all populations are receiving the same opportunity at being successful in treatment programs. It's a challenging issue because the numbers of people from communities of color in this community make it more difficult to set up separate things economically.
Right.
I'm not saying it shouldn't rise to that level of priority and be done, but it does, to be fair, make it more difficult from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
And I don't claim to know what the answers are. I do appreciate the problem you're speaking to, certainly.
Yeah. Well, part of the answer is, you know, because I've turned it around. So I said at a conference, all right, if you don't really want to deal with a cultural competency, let's use, because he was the then Attorney General, let's use the Frohnmeyer rule. Why don't you treat every kid as if they were Dave Frohnmeyer's kid? They're the same, okay? So somebody that you knew, whether you knew them personally, but you had to give them the best care possible, whether you knew what that care was or not, and you'd find resources for them, whatever that is. And also then to turn that around is, okay, if I have to see skinheads, then you can see, you know, either someone with a different language or someone else acquire the capability of treating them successfully, whatever that is, because this is the 21st century. We can find that out. Segueing into budding issues, because when I saw that, you know, quite extensive thing, and we're in a medical marijuana state, so you know, I am the compliance officer for the college in terms of, okay, look.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, you know, I mean, spring comes or even fall comes, and, you know, people get the idea that they can come smoke dope on the nature trail. Like, okay, why would you come to college and smoke weed? Why do you have the idea that that's
okay,
behavior,
right? Yeah.
Right? And then go to and then take your final. I mean, so that kind of stuff happens. So, and so they attempt to use the medical marijuana defense, even though they don't have cards. Right? And I said, okay, look. Under federal laws, we're not even allowed to let you smoke pot on campus with a medical marijuana card.
That's right.
Sorry. You know,
right.
As a matter of practicality, nobody's going to check your lunchbox. So, I mean, if you have cookies.
But still, as a policy, you can't jeopardize all the federal money that comes in.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Okay. So, given that, you know, and also in terms of, you know, state licensing, because, you know, as a drug counselor then, you know, because this comes up, you know, asked Eric Martin, okay, so what can a drug counselor have a medical marijuana card? And he, you know, he didn't hem and haw because, you know, we go back a while. So he said, well, we're not going to seek the equivalent of disbarment if somebody has a card. We're, you know, because, I mean, they're going to have to explain to clients, you know, especially if they're 12-step clients, where are you in recovery? You're going to have to answer that question.
An interesting dynamic.
Yeah, right. But we're not going to, you know, get rid of you. But there we are, right? So in terms of, you know, we are a medical marijuana state. So there are those issues where, you know, fishing on the interstate and, you know, delivery of a controlled substance, you know, by way of, you know, you're being pregnant and all those kind of things. Can you talk about that? Some of the things that you've seen?
The medical marijuana change in Oregon has complicated a lot of things, not in a negative sense.
You ain't kidding.
But it has complicated a lot of things that at least legally, if not morally, were very simple before. And I think we're still working our way through those issues. I don't think we're out the other side of that by any stretch of the imagination. And I, again, I'm conflicted on some of those issues as to what the right answer is, like the issue you were talking about with a drug counselor using marijuana with a medical card. Where's the appropriateness there? Which card trumps which other card? There's concerns on both sides of that, and I honestly don't claim to, you know, be the guy with all the wisdom.
Right. Yeah.
I can tell you that we make sure that people are not punished for having marijuana that they legally are entitled to under the medical marijuana laws. And I actually believe local law enforcement is reasonably sensitive to that. We have clients who are busted for marijuana crimes and they come in and they often tell us that the policeman did ask me if I had a medical marijuana card before they cuffed and stuffed, you know. And so I think local law enforcement is at least at some level a little bit sensitive to those issues.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, that'll obviously improve as well. One common, I might just mention here, since we are talking to more than just you and I, one common misperception is that a California medical marijuana card will somehow help a person in Oregon, and that is simply not true. And so if anybody out there thinks that having a California medical marijuana card will help them not get arrested in Oregon, they're going to learn the hard way that that's not accurate.
Yeah, what have you been smoking?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
We see clients who think that's a helpful fact in their case.
No, they're not transferable state to state.
They're clearly not.
Yeah.
It's sad to see people who don't understand that until it's a little late for them.
Yeah. Right. So in terms of, it didn't really occur to me in terms of looking at the Dewey stuff. How do they even do that? Because basically the current, if I'm familiar with the current standard, okay, just because you have, you know, a quantity of marijuana on you does not necessarily mean that you smoked it, and it also does not mean that you have necessarily diminished. Has there been a intoxication standard set with cannabis?
There is, you're right, you're referring to with alcohol.
Yes, right, blood alcohol level.
The law says there are two ways one can be convicted of DUII with alcohol.
Right.
One is if the testimony convinces a jury that you were noticeably or visibly impaired by alcohol, and if you are a .08 or more on the breath test, then you are presumed to be impaired by alcohol.
Right.
There is no how many nanograms of cannabis metabolite.
Right.
There is not that same magic number that is the presumption in cannabis DUII cases. And so it's all about whether the officer can testify that you were noticeably or visibly impaired by marijuana while you were driving. Then there's the urine test, which is often what happens there, and that's further complicated by the fact that many people will have urine that shows positive for marijuana when they haven't smoked in days, or some cases even weeks if they're heavy users. And so clearly somebody who smoked a joint 2 weeks ago is not impaired by that joint if they haven't smoked it since. And so the burden for the state is that they have to prove that at the time of the driving, the person was impaired by alcohol. I've always thought it was a little bit, by the marijuana, I'm sorry. I've always thought it was a little bit of a cruel joke that the marijuana, arguably one of the least harmful drugs that people consume recreationally, stays in the testable urine stream for a lot longer than alcohol does, or that methamphetamine does, or drugs that are clearly more destructive to our society. But nonetheless, the science is what it is.
When it says, okay, so in the continuing education thing, let us pray, religious use defense for cannabis prosecution. Really? Who can smoke herb as part of their religion?
I have to claim ignorance on that question. I did not go to that particular conference. And I'm unfamiliar with anybody successfully mounting a defense like that.
I would wonder about that.
I don't know that it hasn't been done, but I'm not familiar with it.
So demographically, what kind of clients do you see, if you can sort of generalize or give us like numbers in terms of the cases or types of things that you see through your office?
Okay. We see, as we've already been talking about, quite a few drug cases. Probably the group of cases that we see more of than any other particular group would be property crimes. As we saw recently, property crime rates came out for Oregon, the crime rate statistics, and although statewide property crime is dropping in Lane County, it's going up, and that's no doubt due to the
meth
use in the community, and also due to the fact, like we were talking about with the jail beds, people are reoffending.
Revolving while they're still loaded and wired and looking for a dose.
Right, and rather than sitting in a treatment bed where we would think they would get better and society would benefit, we're not keeping them sometimes long enough for that to happen. And so property crimes is a big deal around here, and that of course ranges everything from the home burglary to the car clout to the bicycles that get stolen. Now with the students back in town, there'll be a number of students from out of the area who learn the hard way about what it takes to secure a bicycle in our community.
Yes.
And we, of course, we represent people charged with everything. We represent clients from DUI all the way up to murder. We take the lion's share. The only type of case we don't take at the public defender's office is an aggravated murder case or a case where the death penalty is being sought. And there are a separate group of lawyers statewide who do those cases. We see a pretty broad cross section of the community in our office. I mean, people from all parts of our community commit crimes, and people from all parts of our community are arrested for those crimes, and a lot of those people are not of great economic circumstance, and so we do see them.
If an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, what kind of advice would you give to potential clients in terms of not seeing you, besides don't do the crime?
We encourage clients to finish their GEDs, for example, or diplomas, or depending on what their situation is. It's a tough world to find a job these days. It's an even tougher world if one doesn't have an education. I don't know that. I can't think of what else I would stress above that.
Well, I mean, that makes a statement about demographic right there, because I'm seeing a number of former corrections clients as part of my student base in my current class, where they say, "Oh, you're going too fast," and it's been a long time since I've been in school. I never completed high school, and was at Coffee Creek, math, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, GED, huh?
Education in general. Education in general. We at the public defender's office, we spend a lot of effort trying to help clients do what they need to do in their lives to not have to be clients again and not be on that horrible cycle where people are doing basically life in prison on the installment plan. There's some real sad tales out there, and we have plenty of business. We don't need clients to reoffend. And so we not only try to fashion a sentence that is helpful to the client to improve their situation, but we do work outside of that to help clients.
I was in Judge Aiken's drug court.
In federal court.
In federal court, right. And part of one of the instructions she handed out was for a client to read a particular book, and I believe it was Eckhart Tolle, the latest Eckhart Tolle thing, right? And he balked at first, and but gradually he got into it. And so one of the things I was looking at in terms of when I do counseling work, unfortunately, because of our training, you need advanced degrees, and you have a certain vocabulary. Clients don't have that vocabulary at all. And so beyond just, whether somebody is competent to stand trial, besides, mental illness, do they have the comprehension to understand what's going on, why they're being sentenced, and then also to benefit from whatever the court deems, not that corrections is necessary to benefit, but when you say, get your GED, get an education, is there ever part of the sentence where education is, mandated, as it were, or seen as corrective?
I've certainly heard judges encourage clients to complete their education. On a couple occasions I've seen that. some credit being given against something else if a client were to do that, or I'll reduce the amount of community service if you finish your diploma or GED. I've seen some of that done. I think in juvenile court that's done a lot more. Judge Leonard out in juvenile court, that's, you know, obviously done more at that level. But it's hard to see people who don't have a lot of skills, don't have a lot of education, don't have a lot of options in this society, particularly in the current economic climate. And it's real tough to see those people and know that you're going to see them again unless something changes. And so at our office we have legal assistants, lawyers, and in particular legal assistants who are pretty plugged into the bigger world of resources outside our office. You know, I mean, we don't have classes, we don't do treatment, we're just the lawyers, but we plug people into the, there's a lot of resources in this community. United Way has a 211 project where you can go to a website and access all different services one might need, and so we try to do what we can. You know, are we enough to change people's lives? Clearly not. No. Not often. But that doesn't stop us from trying to do what's right.
All right. So not a magic wand, but a legal pen. If you could change the system, what would you do? And you have the power to do it. What changes need to be made?
To the legal system?
Sure. Start there.
There needs to be much more treatment. There would be much more treatment resource. While there is plenty of outpatient drug treatment available for people caught up in the criminal justice system, there's a clear shortage of inpatient beds for those people. Yeah, I mean, I guess the one answer I would say off the top of my head would be to vastly increase the treatment resource. We need the punitive. Clearly there's a place for prisons in our society. Clearly there are people, that's where they need to be for a period of time. Clearly there's a need for jail, but more inpatient treatment, more emphasis on, I mean, if I could change the legal system, what I would really do is decriminalize a lot of behavior that I think is a medical problem and does not need to be a punitive problem. If you want to look big picture, if that's where you were going. I see drug addicts as people with a medical disability, and we treat it as criminal behavior rather than as a medical problem. And I think that drives all sorts of ancillary crime. Because marijuana, for example, is against the law, it's very expensive. Because it's against the law, which causes people to commit property crimes to find the money to buy the marijuana. Marijuana itself we call it weed because it wants to grow. It grows easily. It's not a complicated crop. And you know, so that would be a huge thing we could change. Ensuring that people everywhere in America have some reasonable access to competent representation and a relatively fair criminal justice system. Sure, we've talked about problems for people, particularly from maybe communities of color in our criminal justice system here in Eugene, but you know, we both know we're not in rural Alabama, and so you know, while I'm not walking away from the problems we have here to solve. Clearly, there's bigger problems. Relatively speaking, exactly.
I think the piece also, if I were going to, you know, add to what you've said, is that if you're going from the medical point of view of, okay, this is a medical problem, not so much just a legal problem, that increasing the understanding within the criminal justice system of what that means is that people do not do relapse behavior because it's willfulness behavior. But there is some indication from the scientific end of it that continued use of the drug erodes the ability to actually see cause and effects for actions. And so that doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does kind of make relapse behavior somewhat more predictable.
Well, certainly that is also borne out by the fact that among those who are addicted to alcohol or other drugs are some very intelligent people.
Yeah.
And to think it's willful behavior, we would have to assume that everyone with an addiction is an idiot, and we just know that's not true.
Yeah. Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. I very much appreciate you asking me onto this program. I think as a piece of the criminal justice system, we have a lot more to do as a system to do outreach to all the communities that we serve in Lane County and Oregon. And I'm certainly happy to have had this opportunity to begin that dialogue.
Yeah.
This is clearly not the end of the discussion.
Oh, definitely not.
But this is a discussion that we should continue, and I think we can bring in other parts of the criminal justice system into it. And anything you can think of where I can be helpful along those lines is what I'd like to hear.
Sure. I want to thank you for coming.
Mm-hmm.
If you like what you've seen, send us feedback at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Put DiversiTV in the subject line of the email if you're on that side of the digital divide. Otherwise, you can write us in care of the college, but currently we're accepting feedback by email. And tell a friend about the show. And this show will be rebroadcast, I believe, at 9 o'clock on Friday and whatever other times the Oregon Network carries it. Till then, I'm Mark Harris, and go well, stay well.